The day I came home and found a set of metal poles drilled into the middle of my front lawn was the day I realized the HOA wasn't just overstepping, they'd lost their minds. I stepped out of my truck, coffee still hot in my hand, and just stared at the freshly painted sign bolted into my grass. HOA reserved parking only. My name's Grant McAllister. I'm a contractor, a dad, and apparently the only one in this neighborhood who reads contracts before signing them. I dropped my tool bag on the porch and stormed toward the disaster in progress. 3 neon-vested guys were measuring distances from my driveway like they were laying out plans for a strip mall. And there she was, Clarissa Overton, HOA president, queen of clipped hedges and passive-aggressive newsletters. She was standing there with her clipboard like this was a military operation. "Clarissa," I said, "what the hell is this?" She didn't even look surprised. "Grant, we discussed this at last month's meeting. The HOA board voted to designate this area for temporary overflow parking. It's in the community's best interest." I blinked. "My yard is not overflow. It's private property." "You're part of the HOA, Grant," she said, scribbling something on her paper. "You agreed to community compliance. We sent out the notice." "No, you announced it. That doesn't mean I agreed." She gave me that tight smile she always wore when she thought she was winning. "Well, since your lot sits on a corner, it was the most logical choice. And really, it's barely a 20-foot strip." I looked at the stakes in the ground. They'd taken nearly 30 feet of my front lawn, right up to the old rose bush my daughter planted when she was 10. "You know this is illegal, right?" I said, stepping closer. "There's nothing in the HOA charter that lets you claim someone's private yard for parking." Clarissa didn't flinch. "It's part of the easement. You should really read your documents more carefully, Grant." That's when it hit me. I stared at her, then slowly grinned. "You sure about that?" "I'm positive," she said, clearly proud of herself. "Because I think you forgot something," I said, leaning in just enough to watch her expression falter. "You know that little white brick office space the HOA uses on Cedar Lane? The one right next to the gas station." She narrowed her eyes. "What about it?" "I own it, and you lease it from me, month to month." She froze. "Yeah," I said, stepping back, letting that sink in. "You've been paying me rent for almost 2 years. Guess who never signed a long-term lease?" Her mouth opened, then shut again. "You just declared war on the guy who holds the keys to your precious HOA headquarters." I picked up one of the metal signs and yanked it out of the ground. "And you're about to find out how fast a bad decision can spiral." Clarissa's clipboard drooped a little. "You wouldn't dare." "Oh, I absolutely would, and I'll have you out of that office by the end of the week." She turned red like steam whistle red, but I didn't wait for her to respond. I walked back to my porch, picked up my tool bag, and headed inside. They thought they could take my yard. They just gave me the best leverage in the neighborhood. By the time I got inside, I was already pulling up the lease agreement on my computer. I hadn't looked at it in months, but sure enough, there it was signed, dated, and clearly marked as month to month with no automatic renewal clause. I printed 2 copies and tossed them into a folder, then made a few calls. First was to my buddy Darren, a commercial real estate attorney who owed me a favor from a deck renovation I did for his sister. Second was to a locksmith I knew who could change out the locks on a dime if things went sideways. While I waited for callbacks, I stood at the window watching Clarissa and her parking crew pack up. The workers took the last of their cones and left without a word. Clarissa lingered, eyes flicking up toward my house, then back to the mangled patch of lawn they desecrated. She didn't look triumphant anymore, more like someone who just realized she'd kicked over a hornet's nest. I didn't wave. An hour later, Darren called back. "You weren't kidding," he said. "They're squatting in your building without a long-term lease. You can terminate it with 3 days' notice, no problem. You want to go nuclear?" "Oh, I've already started," I said. "I just need to know how clean I can make this." "Clean as bleach," he said. "Send them a notice tomorrow, email and hard copy. If they don't vacate, we file an unlawful detainer and let the sheriff handle it." I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat down and drafted the termination letter. No threats, no emotion, just a formal end to their occupancy, dated and signed. I scheduled a courier to drop it off at the HOA office first thing in the morning. The real fun began the next day. I was pouring coffee when I got the call. "This is outrageous," Clarissa snapped into the phone. You can't just evict us like we're squatters. You're not squatters, I said. You're tenants without a lease. Big difference. There's a community meeting scheduled this week. We need that space. Guess you'll have to move it to a park bench. I recommend the one outside the library. Good shade. You're retaliating. No, I'm responding. You made a call without consulting me. Now I'm making one without consulting you. You're being petty. I hung up. 2 hours later, I was at work on one of my job sites when my phone buzzed again, this time a text from my neighbor, Sophia. She'd been one of the few voices of reason at past HOA meetings, and she never reached out unless something was serious. You need to see what's happening at your house. I think they're trying to dig up your sprinkler system. I left the site in under 5 minutes. When I pulled up, there were 2 men in city maintenance uniforms kneeling in my yard, one of them actively prying at the sprinkler cover near the edge of the sidewalk. A third stood off to the side with a clipboard. Clarissa was behind them, arms folded, pretending to supervise. I parked halfway up my driveway and swung out of the truck. Hey, I barked, step away from that valve. The workers looked up, startled, Clarissa less so. They're documenting municipal access, she said without apology. Some of this land may be under utility easement. No, it's not, I said, walking toward them. And even if it were, you'd need a city permit to touch anything underground. Let me guess you didn't file one. The clipboard guy cleared his throat. Ma'am, I thought you said this was HOA common ground. It is, she said, not even glancing at him. No, it isn't, I said, turning to him. This is a residential lot. Mine. You're standing on private property in violation of trespass laws. And if you so much as scratch that irrigation panel, I'll have you cited. The worker backed off, shoving his screwdriver into his belt. We're leaving. They piled into their truck and drove off. Clarissa didn't. You're going to regret this, she said. I already regret not installing cameras sooner, I replied. But don't worry, I've got it all now. I pointed to the new security camera mounted under the eaves. It had gone up that morning and it had captured everything. She turned and walked off, not another word. That night, I uploaded the footage to a private cloud folder and labeled it with the date and time. Then I made a second folder and started collecting every email, newsletter, and HOA memo from the past year. The pattern was obvious once I looked. Clarissa and her board had been slowly expanding their grip, reclassifying green spaces, issuing unexplained fines, and enforcing community standards that didn't exist in the bylaws. One neighbor had been forced to repaint their fence twice in 2 months. Another was fined for improper trash bin placement when they left their bins out 20 minutes past pickup. It wasn't just me they were targeting. It was anyone who didn't fall in line. The next morning, I showed up at the HOA office with a locksmith and a printed copy of the lease termination notice. The office was closed, but that didn't matter. We changed the locks in under 15 minutes. I taped the notice to the door and sent a photo of it to Clarissa's HOA email. Then I called the fire marshal. Hi, yeah, I'm the property owner at the corner of Cedar and Grove. I just evicted my tenants and HOA group, and I'd like to file a report. I have reason to believe they were storing flammable paint cans and paper files improperly. No ventilation, no fire suppression system. He showed up 20 minutes later. He took one look inside and whistled. Yup, this is a violation waiting to happen. I'll file a report. By noon, the building had a bright orange notice on the door, unsafe for occupancy pending inspection. By 5, Clarissa called again. You've made your point, she said, voice tighter than a violin string. Not yet, I said. I'm just getting started. This will cause chaos. The board has nowhere to meet, no file access. No printing. Sounds like a leadership failure. You're being vindictive. No, I'm being methodical. That was the last time she called me directly. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. Then on Saturday, I saw 3 unfamiliar SUVs parked on the street near my house. Men in suits stepped out, one of them carrying a briefcase. They weren't from the HOA. I grabbed my phone and walked out to meet them. Can I help you, gentlemen? I asked. Already recording, one of them stepped forward. Detective Mark Halstead, City Fraud Division. We're investigating a tip regarding financial mismanagement within the Broad Pines HOA. My eyebrows raised. "You're a little far from Cedar Lane. We were told to start with you. Someone said you might have documentation." I led them inside. I handed over a hard drive with everything I'd compiled: emails, video, newsletters, even audio recordings from past HOA meetings that neighbors had shared with me. It painted an ugly picture: misuse of funds, targeted harassment, and a pattern of actions taken without community votes or legal basis. The detective flipped through the files, nodding slowly. "This is thorough," he said. "If half of this checks out, it's enough to open a full investigation." "Then I suggest starting with their treasurer. I think she's been cooking the books for a while," he smiled. "We'll be in touch." As they left, I watched Clarissa standing across the street near one of the subs, arms crossed, face pale. She didn't come any closer. I didn't wave that time either. The following Monday, traffic in Broad Pines slowed to a crawl. Unmarked sedans rolled past stop signs with deliberate slowness. Men and women in city issued polos visited homes with clipboards. Some took photographs. Others knocked on doors. Word was spreading quietly, but fast, that the HOA was in trouble, and not the kind that went away with a strongly worded memo. I spent the day finishing a porch install across town, but by the time I pulled up to my driveway that evening, I could already see subtle shifts. Lawns that had been trimmed to HOA-mandated perfection were showing signs of intentional neglect: sprinklers turned off, hedges left untouched. Someone had even taken down their American flag, which had previously been required to fly at a 45-degree angle, per some absurd HOA clause. The community was turning. I was halfway through a frozen burrito in the kitchen when the doorbell rang. It was Sophia, holding a thick manila envelope and looking like she hadn't slept in a day. "Can we talk?" she asked. I stepped aside. She sat at the kitchen table, set the envelope down, and opened it without a word. Inside were copies of spreadsheets, handwritten notes, scanned receipts, photocopies of bank transfers. "I was on the finance committee until last month," she said. "Clarissa forced me out after I questioned an expense report, said I wasn't a team player." I flipped through the pages. Thousands of dollars spent on landscaping that had never occurred, payments to a shell company with a P.O. box address. Checks signed by the treasurer but issued without board approval. "This is fraud," I said. "I know," she replied. "And it gets worse. I found a ledger in the storage cabinet at the office before you changed the locks. There are cash withdrawals, multiple. Always just under the reporting threshold. Clarissa, or her husband, he's not officially on the board, but he's been handling deposits." I leaned back, processing. "We need to get this to Halstead," she said. Quietly, "I don't trust the rest of the board. Two of them are real estate agents who have been pushing for new bylaws, ones that would make it easier to fine people and seize liens. They're trying to flip the neighborhood," I said. She nodded. "Gentrify and resell. That's why they wanted your lawn. It was a test case. If they could get away with that, they could do it anywhere." I stood and walked to the living room closet, pulled out the fireproof lockbox where I kept legal documents. Inside was a flash drive I'd been updating with every new development. I added Sophia's files to it, then encrypted a backup onto my cloud. "We'll meet Halstead tomorrow," I said, "but we do it on neutral ground." The next morning, we met at a diner on the edge of town. Halstead was already there, sipping coffee, a legal pad open in front of him. Sophia slid into the booth beside me and handed over the envelope. He flipped through it slowly, jotting notes with a mechanical pencil. "I've seen HOA corruption before," he said finally, "but this is organized. This is criminal conspiracy." "What happens next?" I asked. "We'll need a forensic audit," he said. "I'll start the paperwork today. If the DA signs off, we'll subpoena bank accounts, call in the treasurer, and freeze the HOA's operational funds. If your evidence holds, this could lead to felony charges." Sophia looked pale but resolute. Halstead packed up the envelope and slid his card across the table. "Keep your heads down," he said. "This kind of thing doesn't go away quietly." He wasn't wrong. That night, someone tried to break into my truck. The motion lights caught them before they got close, and the security cameras recorded everything. A man in a hoodie, gloves on, pacing near the driver's side door before sprinting off when the floodlight hit. I called it in, filed a police report, and emailed the footage to Halstead. The next morning, Clarissa launched a last-ditch offensive. A new HOA bulletin was slid under every door on the block. It was written like a manifesto, long paragraphs about community unity, resisting defamation, and dangerous individuals seeking to dismantle the harmony of Broad Pines. It didn't name me directly, but the implication was clear. Sophia's name was listed under a section titled Individuals No Longer in Good Standing. That same afternoon, a tow truck tried to take my neighbor's sedan from her driveway. Apparently, the HOA had declared it abandoned because of a dented bumper. The driver left empty-handed after I walked out with my phone and announced I was recording a potential theft. Things escalated fast. 2 days later, a judge signed off on the audit. Halstead showed up at the HOA's temporary meeting space, a rented room at the library, and served Clarissa in person. She tried to deny him access, said she was in the middle of confidential board business. He didn't even blink. "You have 24 hours to turn over all financial records," he said. "Failure to comply will result in a search warrant." By that weekend, the treasurer resigned. The resignation email leaked probably from someone on the inside and described gross mismanagement, manipulated ledgers, and pressure to backdate approvals. It also named Clarissa directly. Public opinion flipped overnight. A group of residents formed an emergency committee, citing the HOA's own bylaws that allowed for a special vote to remove the board in cases of misconduct. Flyers went up. Petitions circulated. People who hadn't attended a single HOA meeting in years were now knocking on doors with clipboards and receipts. I stayed out of the spotlight, but not idle. I dug up the original HOA charter, the one buried in a county archive that had never been digitized. It had clear language about term limits, voting thresholds, and most importantly, a clause that required all major decisions to be ratified by homeowner vote. Clarissa had violated that clause at least a dozen times. I sent the scanned pages to the emergency committee. Then I sat on my porch with a beer and waited. The vote happened 10 days later. Clarissa tried to stall it, claimed it was invalid, even threatened legal action. No one listened. At the community center, residents lined up out the door. They signed their names, cast their ballots, and whispered to each other in the parking lot while old alliances crumbled. When the results were tallied, the board was dissolved by an overwhelming margin. Clarissa didn't even stay to hear the final count. She left before the last ballot was read, walking stiffly to her SUV past neighbors who didn't meet her gaze. I watched from the back of the room as she drove off, tires crunching over gravel, gone before the new committee announced their interim leadership. 2 weeks later, Halstead called. "Charges have been filed," he said. The treasurer took a deal. Clarissa's facing 3 counts: embezzlement, falsifying financial records, and conspiracy to defraud. "Will it stick?" I asked. "With the evidence you helped collect, absolutely." I hung up and walked outside. The metal poles that had once scarred my lawn were gone, pulled up and hauled away by the new board. The grass was still recovering, but the rose bush had survived tougher than it looked. Neighbors passed by and waved. Some stopped to chat, others just nodded. The air felt different now. Lighter. Like a weight had been lifted from the whole block. Sophia dropped by that evening with a bottle of wine and a smile I hadn't seen in weeks. "They're setting up a real vote next month," she said. "No power grabs, just open nominations and transparent ballots. You gonna run?" I laughed. "Not a chance," she raised an eyebrow. "Why not? You already took down a corrupt regime." "Exactly," I said. "I'm retired." We clinked glasses on the porch while the sun dipped behind the rooftops. Broad Pines wasn't perfect, but it was ours again. The new HOA board wasted no time. Within a week of the vote, they'd set up temporary operations in the old community garden shed behind the tennis courts, bare bones, but functional. They were transparent, responsive, and most importantly, not trying to annex people's lawns. I dropped by one evening with a folder of documents I hadn't handed over during the initial investigation, things I'd dug up from the county clerk's office that clarified some of the easement boundaries. The new president, a former civil engineer named Brenda, took one look and said, We've been guessing where the common areas even start. This changes everything." It did. The maps showed that many of the areas the previous board treated as HOA property were actually private parcels. That included the strip of land where Clarissa had tried to install those parking signs on my lawn. It was irrefutable now, and Brenda promised to have a surveyor update the HOA's maps officially. But Clarissa wasn't done. Not quite. A week after her removal, a letter arrived at my doorstep. No return address. Inside was a single page, typed and unsigned. "You think you've won, but this isn't over. You've made enemies, powerful ones." I read it twice, then tucked it under the flap of my security camera footage binder. I wasn't worried, not yet. But I did forward a photo of it to Detective Halstead. He called later that day. "Keep the letter. We might be able to trace the printer if we get more like it. For now, consider it an empty threat." Clarissa's legal team is scrambling to keep her out of jail. I hadn't asked for updates, but he gave them anyway. The forensic audit had uncovered a second bank account, this one in the name of a landscaping company that had never actually performed any services. The account had Clarissa listed as a silent partner. Her husband had opened it using a fake name and a business license registered to a vacant lot. The total amount funneled through it over the past 18 months, just shy of $116,000. That wasn't mismanagement. That was laundering. The district attorney had already filed charges: grand larceny, wire fraud, falsifying financial documents. The works. They were building a racketeering case, which meant they were treating the HOA as a criminal enterprise, at least under Clarissa's leadership. The new board voted unanimously to cooperate. Meanwhile, I kept quiet and watched. 2 streets over, an older couple who'd been fined repeatedly for non-compliant mailbox paint were suddenly free of penalties. Another neighbor, a disabled veteran who'd been threatened with foreclosure over unpaid fines, had his record wiped. The new board was reviewing every complaint, fine, and enforcement order issued during Clarissa's tenure. They found patterns. Selective enforcement. Timed citations that lined up with home sales. And buried in the digital records, a handful of anonymous complaints, all originating from the same IP address, Clarissa's. But it wasn't just about money anymore. The forensic team found something else. Encrypted files on the HOA's office computer, ones Clarissa had deleted, likely thinking no one would ever recover them. But they did. Inside were dozens of partially filled application forms for HOA board candidacy. Names, addresses, and in some cases, copies of licenses or personal ID documents. All scanned, all left unprotected. One of the files was labeled "Priority Candidates Remove." That's when the FBI got involved. They weren't interested in lawn disputes or petty fines, but identity theft, data abuse. That was federal. Halstead called me again, this time with a different tone. "You're going to be contacted by a federal agent," he said. "They're expanding the investigation. Turns out Clarissa was selling resident data to a third-party real estate firm, leads for pre-foreclosure homes. That's where the real money was." I didn't even know what to say. All that over a parking space. It wasn't about the parking. It was about control and profit. The agent came by 2 days later. He wore a plain sports coat, didn't give his full name, and asked for a quiet place to talk. I brought him into the garage where I kept my records and tools. He asked about everything: when I first noticed something was wrong, who I spoke to, how I obtained the lease documents, and whether I'd ever received anything in return for allowing the HOA to use my office space. "Nope," I said. "They paid monthly. That's it." Never even said thank you. He nodded, took notes, and asked if I'd be willing to testify if it came to trial. I told him yes. He handed me a card with only a direct number and said, "If anyone contacts you, tries to intimidate you, or even breathes in your direction wrong, call me." I didn't need to. The pressure stopped overnight. Clarissa was arrested the following week. It wasn't loud. No sirens. No cuffs in the street, just a quiet knock on her door and a pair of agents in dark suits. She was escorted out of her house and into a black SUV without a single neighbor coming to her defense. The next morning, someone updated the HOA website. Her name was gone. Her emails were removed. The page listed only the interim board and a note that said under formal restructuring. Sophia came by that evening. She dropped off a small potted plant lavender, she said, to help clean the air. I set it by the rose bush. You hear the latest? She asked. No, I said. I've been trying not to. She's taking a plea, Sophia said. 12 years, no parole for at least 5. I didn't celebrate, not out loud. But I felt something settle, relief maybe, or just the weight of knowing that consequences had finally caught up to her. The community held a block party 2 weeks later. Nothing fancy, just folding tables, potluck dishes, and a rented bounce house for the kids. For the first time in over a year, people laughed without watching their backs. No fines. No threats. No HOA patrols taking photos of garbage bins. Brenda gave a short speech, thanked everyone for voting, promised transparency. Asked for patience while they fixed the damage. When she was done, she handed me a sealed envelope in front of everyone. Inside was a certificate of appreciation, signed by the board. Along with a waiver, any fines ever issued against my property rescinded permanently. I didn't need it, but I nodded anyway. Later that night, Sophia and I sat on the porch while the leftover kids chased each other with glow sticks. You still retired? She asked. I laughed. Fully. Don't even want to be on the newsletter committee. Shame, she said. You'd be good on the landscaping review board. I raised an eyebrow. Did you just threaten me? She grinned and handed me a brownie. The house was quiet after she left. I walked out to the sidewalk, looked at my lawn, the spot where the signs had once stood, now green again, the sprinkler heads back in place. I looked down the street. No more reserved parking signs, no more surveillance vans, just neighbors, yards, and porch lights. Justice hadn't come easy. But it had come, and Clarissa. She could enjoy her new accommodations far from Broad Pines, far from her clipboard, and far from anyone's front yard.